The sound that woke me was not a knock. It was the high, rhythmic scrape of a trowel dragging across fresh mortar, coming from the south side of my property at 7:40 on a Sunday morning. And by the time I pulled on my boots and got outside, Renata Hollis had already laid 3 courses of cinder block across the opening where my side gate had stood for 11 years. She was standing back from the work with her arms folded and a small smile on her face, the kind of smile that belongs to someone who has already decided the matter is finished. And behind her stood 2 men in unmarked gray shirts who were mixing a second batch of compound in a plastic drum, and the air smelled of Portland cement and something colder than the morning itself. Renata was 51 years old, blonde, and wore the red blazer of the Cresthaven Ridge Homeowners Association Board of Directors over a white button-down shirt, and her hair was pinned flat and precise against the back of her head, as though she had dressed for a closing ceremony. She told me, without turning to face me fully, that the side access point had been declared a common boundary encroachment under Article 9 of the Association's revised covenants, that the board had voted on Thursday evening, and that remediation had commenced per the schedule she had mailed to what she described as my last known address, which was the address of the house I had lived in without interruption since I bought it 14 years ago, which meant the notice had never been sent, or had been sent to be ignored. I am Caleb Durst, 32 years old, a licensed civil engineer with 14 years of title records sitting in a fireproof cabinet in my garage, and I told her plainly that she was building on a documented easement, that I had the survey in my hand, and that she had until I returned from my truck to stop the work. She did not stop the work. She told one of the gray-shirted men to continue, and told me that the survey I was holding was not the current controlling document. She had no idea what the current controlling document actually said. She had no idea what I was able to do before Monday morning, or what I had already begun to do the moment I heard that trowel. Stay with this story to the end, because the gate was open again before 9 o'clock on Monday, and Renata Hollis had not yet grasped, standing there in her blazer with wet mortar on her shoes, what 11 years of quiet record-keeping and 1 telephone call to a county sheriff's deputy was about to cost her. The house on Cresthaven Ridge Road came to me through 11 years of ordinary accumulation and 4 years of deliberate searching before that. I had grown up in a rental on the eastern edge of the county, in a house where the landlord changed the locks without warning twice before I turned 16, and I understood early what it meant to occupy a space without owning it, and I understood equally well what it meant to have paper in your hand that said the space was yours. When I passed my civil engineering licensure exam at 24, the first thing I did before buying any furniture was hire a surveyor to walk the boundaries of every lot I was seriously considering, and I kept those survey reports in plastic sleeves in a 3-ring binder labeled simply property, and the binder went into a fireproof cabinet that I bought second-hand from a county records office, which seemed to me at the time to be a reasonable kind of irony. The house itself was a 1960s ranch on a corner lot, 1,800 square feet, with a 2-car garage that faced the side street and a driveway that ran along the southern property line in a narrow corridor between my garage wall and the community's decorative retaining wall, which the association had installed in the early 1990s, along what it claimed was its own boundary. The side gate was set into a cedar fence at the end of that corridor, and it gave me access from the driveway to the backyard without passing through the garage, and it gave my neighbor Troy Aiken, who owned the lot directly behind mine, a shortcut he had used by informal agreement for the better part of a decade to reach the mailbox cluster at the corner without walking the long way around. The gate had been there when I bought the house. The gate appeared in the real estate listing photographs. The gate appeared in the title company's survey overlay, which showed it sitting inside the boundary of my property by 4 feet and 8 inches on the east side and by 6 feet and 1 inch from the retaining wall on the south side, meaning it was on my land, inside my fence, and had never been within the definition of common boundary under any reading of the association's own founding documents. I knew this because I had read the founding documents. I knew this because I had read the revised covenants when they were issued in 2019, and again when a second revision was circulated in 2022, and both times I had noted that Article 9, which governed boundary encroachments, explicitly exempted structures pre-existing the covenant's adoption date, and my gate pre-existed both revisions by more than a decade. I had not done any of this in anticipation of a dispute. I had done it because reading the documents that govern the place where you live struck me as a reasonable minimum. The way checking the oil in a vehicle you drive every day strikes most people as a reasonable minimum, and I had never found a reason to feel otherwise about it. Renata Hollis had joined the board 18 months earlier, coming in as the new representative for the South Cluster of lots, which included mine, after the previous representative, a retired schoolteacher named Gerald Foss, had stepped down for health reasons. Gerald had sent me a note when he left, handwritten on a half sheet of yellow legal paper, telling me that the new board was moving fast and that I should read whatever they sent me carefully. I had kept the note. It was in the property binder, in a plastic sleeve, behind the survey reports. Renata's first notice to me had arrived 9 weeks before the Sunday morning of the cinder blocks, and it had arrived not by certified mail but as a standard printed letter left in my mailbox, which meant there was no delivery confirmation and no required signature, and the letter stated that the board had identified my side gate as a possible common boundary encroachment under Article 9, and that I was invited to appear before the board at its next regular meeting to discuss the matter. I appeared. I brought the binder. I sat at the folding table they had arranged in the community room of the clubhouse, and I set the binder on the table in front of me, while Renata, seated at the head of the board's table in her red blazer, explained that the association had commissioned its own boundary analysis, and that the analysis had concluded my fence line and gate structure were incompatible with the retaining wall's recorded easement corridor. I asked quietly who had conducted the analysis. She named a firm I did not recognize. I asked whether the analysis had been conducted by a licensed surveyor. She said it had been conducted by a consultant. I asked for a copy of the report. She told me that the report was an internal board document and was not subject to member review under the association's standing rules. I wrote that exchange down in the small notebook I had brought, noting the time and the names of the 3 board members present, and I told her plainly that I would need to see the underlying survey data before I could respond substantively, and that I was reserving all rights in the meantime. She told me that the board would proceed on its schedule. I thanked the board and walked out, and in the parking lot I called Marcus Veen, a property rights attorney I had worked with on 2 infrastructure easement cases during my time at the county engineer's office, and I described the situation while I sat in my truck with the engine off and the binder on the passenger seat. Marcus told me that without a copy of their analysis and without a formal notice of violation sent by certified mail, the board's legal footing was thin, and that I should request both in writing, by certified letter, and keep the receipts. I mailed that letter the following morning. The board did not respond within the 30-day window the association's own bylaws specified for written member inquiries. The 30-day window closed on a Thursday. The cinder blocks arrived the following Sunday. The 2 men in gray shirts worked without stopping for 3.5 hours. By 11 in the morning they had filled the gate opening to a height of 5 courses, which was roughly 4 feet, and they had applied a skim coat of finish mortar to the face of the new wall that looked practiced and unhurried, the kind of surface that is meant to suggest permanence rather than just height. Renata had left after the first hour, telling the men that she would return at noon to inspect, and in her absence I did 5 things in the order I had decided on before she pulled out of the street. First, I photographed the wall at every stage, with timestamps enabled on my phone, and I photographed the retaining wall and the gate posts and the ground on both sides to show the boundary markers that were visible, including a survey pin I had placed myself 7 years earlier during a drainage project, and I photographed the plastic drum of mortar compound, which had a manufacturer's label on the side that gave the batch number and the setting time. Second, I called Marcus Veen on his cell and left a voice message describing what was happening and giving him the times and the number of courses and the approximate dimensions of the opening being closed. Third, I walked to Troy Aiken's house and knocked on his back door and told him what was being done and asked whether he had seen or heard anything before Sunday morning that might help establish a timeline. Troy, who was 68 years old and a retired postal inspector, said he had heard vehicles on the street at 6:45, which was before I had woken up, and he offered to write a statement. I told him I would be back with a form. Fourth, I retrieved from the fireproof cabinet the original deed to my property, the survey report from my purchase, the survey overlay from the title company, the 2019 covenant document, the 2022 covenant revision, the certified mail receipt from my inquiry letter, and the postmarked envelope from Renata's first notice, which established that it had been sent standard rather than certified. Fifth, I called the non-emergency line for the county sheriff's office and reported that a structure was being erected on my property without my consent, and that the parties responsible claimed association authority for the action. The dispatcher asked whether there was an active threat. I told her there was not an active threat, that the matter was a property rights issue, and that I was requesting a deputy come by to observe conditions and take a report. She told me a deputy would be by within the afternoon. Renata returned at noon as promised, walked the length of the new wall, ran her hand along the skim coat, and nodded at the men. She noticed me standing at the garage door with my phone raised, and she told me that photographing association contractors during authorized work was a violation of the community standards policy. I told her. She told me I would be hearing from the board's attorney. I told her that was fine and that Marcus Veen's contact information was on file with the board from the letter I had sent by certified mail 37 days earlier, which had gone unanswered. She did not reply to that. Deputy Kevin Reese arrived at 2:15 in the afternoon, a methodical man in his early 40s who listened without interrupting while I walked him from the gate opening, now fully bricked, to the corner of the lot where the survey pin was visible in the ground, and then back along the fence line while I narrated the boundary measurements from the survey overlay I was holding. He asked how I knew the pin was mine and not a common boundary marker. I showed him the survey report with the pin described by coordinate, and I showed him the coordinate on the overlay, and I showed him the distance from the pin to the center of the bricked opening, which was 6 feet and 1 inch, meaning the new wall sat 6 feet and 1 inch inside my property line as surveyed and recorded. Deputy Reese wrote everything down in a small green notebook. He photographed the wall, the pin, and the survey documents I was holding, and he asked whether the association had provided me with a written order authorizing the work. I showed him Renata's letter and explained that it had not been sent certified and had not been followed by any formal notice of violation as the bylaws required. He asked whether I had made a written request to the board. I showed him the certified mail receipt. He asked whether the board had responded. I showed him the absence of a response in the 37 days since the letter had arrived. He studied the receipt for a moment, and then he looked at the wall, and then he asked me, plainly, whether I wanted to pursue this through the sheriff's office or through the courts. I told him both, and that I had already retained an attorney, and that what I needed from him tonight was a property damage report and his own observation of the boundary markers as a matter of official record. He said he could do that, and he did it, spending another 40 minutes on my property taking measurements and photographs and writing notes. And before he left, he gave me his direct phone number and told me that if I heard anything from the association overnight, I should call him rather than the dispatch line. He had not come in, assuming I was right. He had looked at the ground and the documents and the ground again, and drawn his own conclusion. and that conclusion was written in a green notebook that would later become one of the more useful items of evidence in the formal hearing. Marcus Veen called me at 7 that evening and told me he had reached the association's attorney, a man named Philip Bard, who handled several HOA accounts in the county, and that Philip had indicated the board believed it was operating within its authority under Article 9 and was prepared to defend the position. Marcus told me that was good news, because Philip Bard had not yet seen the survey overlay or the covenant's pre-existing structure exemption, and that when he did, he would advise his client to reverse the action immediately, because no competent attorney would take that case to a judge. Marcus also told me something else, which he had learned from a colleague who sat on a neighboring association's review panel. Renata Hollis had done this before. 18 months earlier, in the Millbridge Commons development 4 miles north of Cresthaven Ridge, she had served briefly on a design review committee, and during that time had authorized the removal of a homeowner's approved fence under a boundary claim that was later found to be fabricated from a misrepresented survey. And the homeowner in that case, a man named Dennis Partlow, who was 73 years old and had no professional background in land records, had paid $11,000 in restoration costs before he understood that the survey Renata's committee had relied on had been prepared by a company with no active state license. That homeowner had eventually prevailed in small claims court, but only after the fence had been down for 7 months, and only after a neighbor who happened to work in the county assessor's office had recognized the unlicensed firm's name and pulled the licensing records for him. Dennis Partlow had not known to do that himself. I had known how to look it up within 20 minutes of getting off the phone with Marcus, and by 9 o'clock that evening I had the current license status of every surveying and consulting firm operating in the county, and I had confirmed that the firm Renata had named at the board meeting as the source of her boundary analysis held no active state license, and had in fact surrendered its registration in the previous spring, which meant that the analysis she had presented to justify the wall was not just procedurally defective but legally void on its face, and that every board member who had voted based on it had either not known or had not bothered to check, and neither possibility was more defensible than the other. I sent Marcus the licensing records at 9:14 and went to bed. Marcus filed for an emergency temporary restraining order in county civil court at 8 Monday morning, attaching the survey overlay, the covenant exemption clause, the certified mail receipt, the board's non-response, Deputy Reese's property report, and the licensing status of the association's consultant. The judge reviewed the filing in chambers and issued the order at 9:40, which required the association to halt any further construction or alteration on the disputed boundary, and to restore the access opening to its pre-Sunday condition within 72 hours at the association's expense. Philip Bard called Marcus at 10:15 and asked whether his client could have a week. Marcus said no. Philip Bard asked whether the survey matter was genuinely insurmountable. Marcus read him the exemption clause and then read him the consultant's license surrender date and said it was genuinely insurmountable. At 11:30, Renata Hollis appeared at my driveway in her red blazer, without the 2 gray-shirted men and without Philip Bard, and she told me that the board was prepared to authorize restoration of the gate and to close the matter as an administrative misunderstanding. I told her without raising my voice that the matter was no longer solely between me and the board, that a formal investigation into the consultant's credentials and the board's authorization process had been requested through the county civil division, and that any offer of settlement she was making should go through Marcus Veen. She stood on my driveway for a moment without speaking. She looked at the wall. She had not brought anything with her to write on. No clipboard, no folder, no binder. She left. The wall came down on Tuesday afternoon, not by the 2 gray-shirted men, but by a licensed masonry contractor the board hired at emergency rates, and the gate post was reset and the cedar panel was rehung by noon on Wednesday. and Troy Aiken used it Thursday morning to collect his mail without breaking stride, and he knocked on my back door afterward to tell me the latch worked perfectly. The county civil division completed its administrative review 4 months after the wall came down, and the findings were precise and without ambiguity. The board's authorization vote was voided because it had relied exclusively on a report prepared by an unlicensed firm, rendering the vote procedurally void under state HOA governance statute. Renata Hollis was removed from the board by a member recall vote that passed with 71% of ballots cast, and the recall petition had been circulated by her own fellow board members after Philip Bard presented them with the licensing records and the Millbridge Commons history, and explained plainly what personal liability exposure they faced if they remained associated with her decisions. 2 board members submitted written statements to the Civil Division describing what they had and had not been told before the vote, and those statements corroborated that Renata had presented the consultant's analysis as a certified survey without identifying the firm or its standing. Dennis Partlow, the man from Millbridge Commons who had spent $11,000 in 7 months, filed a separate action with the assistance of a legal aid organization and the county's Homeowners Association Oversight Panel, activated by the Civil Division's findings, opened a formal review of Renata's history across both associations. That review ultimately produced a recommendation that she be permanently barred from serving in any governance role within county-registered homeowner associations, and the County Board of Supervisors adopted the recommendation by consensus. Philip Bard settled the restoration costs, legal fees, and compensatory damages with Marcus in the amount of $31,000, paid from the association's reserve fund, and the payment itself generated a special assessment on every member of Cresthaven Ridge that was itemized on every homeowner's quarterly statement, so that the cost of Renata's Sunday project was visible to every one of the 94 households she had claimed to represent. Gerald Foss, the retired school teacher who had sent me the handwritten warning on yellow legal paper, heard about the outcome from Troy Aiken and mailed me a second note, shorter than the first, which said only that he had hoped it would go that way. I kept that note in the binder beside the first one. The gate stands exactly where it always stood, and the survey pin in the corner of the lot is visible when the grass is low. A small steel cap stamped with a coordinate number that means nothing to most people, and everything to the record that governs this ground. The empty stretch of lawn where the mortar drums sat for those 3.5 hours on a Sunday morning has grown back fully, and if you did not know to look, you would find no trace of what was built there, and unmade. The person who had the paperwork did not need to raise her voice, and the person who did not check the paperwork did not need to raise a wall. Power is not the same thing as authority, and silence is not the same thing as surrender, and anyone who cannot tell the difference between the two will eventually discover that the person they assumed was quiet was simply counting. The investigation into Renata Hollis did not conclude with the county panel's recommendation, because recommendations, however precisely worded, are not the same as consequences, and Marcus had understood from the beginning that the administrative record we had built was worth considerably more than the settlement check. What the Civil Division's review had produced, beyond its own findings, was a chain of disclosure: the licensing records, the Millbridge Commons documentation, the 2 board members' written statements, and Deputy Reese's property report had all been entered into the public case file, and public case files in the County Civil Division are searchable by any resident with a library card and 30 minutes of patience, and within 6 weeks of the file being closed, a reporter at the county's weekly newspaper, a woman named Claire Sato, who covered municipal affairs with the quiet persistence of someone who had been doing it long enough to know that the interesting stories were usually in the attachments rather than the body of the filing, had found the file and read every page of it. She called Marcus first, because Marcus's name was on the filings, and Marcus gave her my number after asking whether I was willing to speak. I was willing to speak. I met Claire Sato at the kitchen table on a Thursday afternoon, and I answered her questions for 2 hours while the binder sat open between us, and I answered them the same way I had answered Deputy Reese's questions 8 months earlier, by pointing at documents rather than at conclusions, and letting the documents carry the weight. The story ran in the paper the following Thursday under a headline about association governance and unlicensed consultants, and it named Renata Hollis and the firm she had used and the settlement amount and the Millbridge Commons history, and it quoted Dennis Partlow, who said that he had felt for 7 months as though he had done something wrong, and had only understood after the county panel's findings that he had simply been the first person Renata had tried it on who didn't have someone in the assessor's office to call. The story was picked up by 2 regional news outlets within a week, and within the month, the state's HOA Governance Reform Coalition cited it in a public comment letter to the state legislature, arguing for mandatory licensing requirements for any consultant retained by a homeowner association for boundary analysis, and that letter named the Cresthaven Ridge case as a specimen of the gap in existing law that made the whole sequence possible. None of that had been my goal on the Sunday morning when I stood in my driveway with a phone raised and cement dust in the air. My goal had been the gate, and the gate was open, and everything that followed it was the consequence of Renata having done what she did in the open, in daylight, in front of a man who knew how to read the documents she had not bothered to read herself. The new Cresthaven Ridge Board convened its first meeting 6 weeks after the recall election and elected a board chair, a retired structural engineer named Bart Holden, who had lived in the North Cluster for 9 years and who had voted in every prior election without ever seeking a seat until the recall petition landed in his mailbox, and he read it twice and called the legal aid office on his own initiative to understand what the exposure was. Bart called me 3 days after his election and asked whether I would be willing to sit on the newly formed Governance and Documents Committee, which would be tasked with auditing every policy the previous board had passed in the 18 months of Renata's tenure, and cross-referencing each one against the founding covenants and the state statute. I told him I would sit on the committee if it was understood that my role was to read and assess and not to lead, because I was not interested in becoming the board's engineer by informal accretion, which is how a lot of unpaid institutional work gets done to people who are willing to do it. He said that was entirely understood. The committee met for the first time in the clubhouse on a Tuesday evening, with 4 members including me, and we worked through the 18 months of board minutes in reverse chronological order, starting from the most recent and working backward. And we found 7 policies that had been passed on the basis of the same unlicensed consultant's analysis, and that would need to be individually reviewed, and in 4 cases voided. And we found 2 cases in which homeowners had received violation notices under those voided policies and had paid fines totaling $4,300 without understanding that the authority behind the notices was procedurally hollow. Those 2 homeowners were identified from the board's own payment records, which Bart had requested in his first act as chair, and both were contacted by certified letter within 2 weeks of the committee's finding, and both received full refunds from the reserve fund, and both were invited to submit a formal objection for the record, which both did, and both objections were entered into the association's permanent files so that the pattern of the prior board's behavior would be visible to any future member who thought to look. The forensic work took 4 months in total, and by the time the committee submitted its final report to the full board, the document ran to 31 pages and had been reviewed by Marcus before submission, not because Marcus was being paid for the work, which he was not, but because he had said when we began that he wanted to see how it came out, having followed the original matter from a Sunday morning phone call to a county panel recommendation, and he thought a clean formal record was worth having. The report was adopted by the board unanimously and posted to the association's member portal, where it was available to all 94 households, and 3 members called Bart in the week after posting to say they had read it, which Bart reported to me with the mild satisfaction of someone who had not expected 3, but would have settled for one. One of those 3 callers was an elderly woman named Ruth Calloway, who had lived in the East Cluster for 22 years, and who said she had never understood before why the rules seemed to change without warning, and without anyone being able to say clearly why, and who asked whether the committee would be a permanent body. Bart told her it would be. She asked whether she could attend a meeting as an observer. He said she could attend as a member if she wanted to, and she became the committee's 5th member the following month, bringing with her a handwritten ledger she had kept since 2009 of every board notice she had ever received, and every response she had ever sent, and every date she had ever called the management company, which turned out to be a more complete contemporaneous record of the association's administrative history than anything the board's own files contained, and which the committee used to reconcile 3 disputed timelines in the final report. Renata Hollis did not attend any of the proceedings after the recall vote. She had sold her property in Cresthaven Ridge within 60 days of the recall, without listing it publicly, in a cash transaction that closed quickly, and she had moved to a rental on the other side of the county, which Marcus learned from the assessor's transfer records, and which he passed along to me without commentary. The county panel's bar recommendation had been adopted, which meant she could not serve in any registered association governance role in the county, and the state coalition had flagged her name in its case documentation, which meant any association conducting reasonable due diligence on a prospective board member would find the public record before she had a chance to present herself. Whether she would find another venue in which to practice the particular skill she had developed, which was the skill of presenting institutional authority as though it were settled fact to people who had not yet thought to check whether the institution's authority was real, was not something I could know, and it was not something I spent time on. My concern had been the gate and the ground it stood on, and those were accounted for. The 2 gray-shirted men who turned out to be employees of a landscaping company that Renata had hired for general site maintenance and who had been told simply that they were filling an unauthorized opening on association property were never subjects of any proceeding, because they had been told what they were told and had done what was reasonable to do with the information they had been given. One of them, a man in his late 20s named Greg, who had been the one actually laying the block while the other managed the drum, had knocked on my door 3 weeks after the wall came down to say that he was sorry and that he had not known, and that if he had known he would not have done it. I told him I understood, and I meant it, because the document that would have told him the truth was in my fireproof cabinet, not in the materials Renata had provided him, and the gap between those 2 places was entirely her creation. He seemed relieved by that. He left, and I did not see him again. The gate has a new latch now, a heavier one that Troy Aiken noticed and approved of when he came through it on a Thursday morning in March, 16 months after the Sunday of the cinder blocks, and he stood at my back door long enough to drink a cup of coffee and report that the latch seated cleanly and the cedar panel hung level and true, which it did, because the contractor who had rehung it had set the post in concrete and checked the plumb twice. The survey pin in the corner of the lot had a new marker flag, a small orange plastic tag on a wire, that I had placed there the autumn after the settlement as a reminder to myself that the coordinate was worth keeping visible, not as a monument to the dispute but as a practice, the way checking the records regularly keeps them from needing to be defended urgently. Marcus had sent me a printed copy of the committee's final report in the mail, with a note that said simply, "Good work," and I had put it in the binder in the section behind the original survey report, where it sat in a plastic sleeve next to Gerald Foss's 2 yellow paper notes and the postmarked envelope from Renata's uncertified first notice. And the binder went back into the fireproof cabinet where it had always lived, because the cabinet was where documents belonged, and documents were what the whole matter had always been about. A wall built without authority is only mortar and block. A record built without gaps is the thing that outlasts it.